Set of notes. This is Unit 6, Evolution 1. So we're doing notes on B7A. So take a minute, pause this, and set up your page so you can take notes. So we have B7A, and remember you can pause this whenever you need to. B7A says that you're going to analyze and evaluate. So you're going to look for patterns, and you're going to check to see if the data is good or whatever. So you're going to analyze and evaluate how evidence of common ancestry in groups of organisms is provided by the fossil record, by biogeography, and the TEK also says by homologies including anatomical, molecular, and developmental, but we're going to get that on the next page of notes. So I'm just going to put and ... and we'll get that on the next page over here. So the first word we need to talk about is evolution. And I know that there are many of you out there, there are some out there that on a religious basis get really a little bit freaked out over the theory of evolution. And let me explain this again, and I remind you of what we talked about at the very first of the school year. The evolutionary theory does not say God doesn't exist. The evolutionary theory is limited to what we can see, hear, taste, touch, and smell. So, like all science, it's limited in its scope. The science is a beautiful tool. It's very, very useful. It's very beautiful, but it's always and specifically limited to what we can see, hear, taste, touch, and smell. Nowhere in your science book are you going to find a chapter on God. Nowhere in your science book will you find a chapter written on love. And that doesn't mean that they don't exist. It means that we can't deal with that with our five senses, see, hear, taste, touch, smell. We can't measure it, the length, the width, the height, the mass. We can't do anything at all like that. So science ignores that. It can't study that, so it doesn't go into that realm and deal with that. In the same sense, the theory of evolution is limited, again, to what we can see, hear, taste, touch, smell. Personally, I am a Christian, and I don't have an issue between the theory of evolution and my Christianity. My Christianity is based on faith. Those of you who aren't Christians, don't worry about this. You can ignore this bit. But my Christianity is based on faith. That's what I can't see, hear, taste, touch, smell. And the science here is based on the five senses here. So when we deal with this, for my personal purposes, I see God as the ultimate scientist. He created DNA. He created fossils. He created all of this stuff. He created the atom made of the proton, neutron, electron, and with the electrons at just the perfect distances apart in each atom so that they combine and create all sorts of other things. So I don't have an issue between science and my Christianity. And that's all I'll talk about that on. If you guys have questions, you're welcome to ask me, but that's something outside the realm of the regular school day. This is something that we just focus on the science that's here. So the evolution, in a generic way, a simple generic definition would be change over time. But in a lot of cases, that's not what we're talking about. I mean, basically, you guys evolved from when you were 6 months old to now that you're 15 years old. There's a big change over time that's made. But that's typically not what we're talking about in science when we talk about evolution. It's much more broad than that. This is any hereditary changes. Hereditary changes in groups of organisms and it's looking at those changes over time. So it's not just looking at one organism and how it grows and changes over time. It's looking at groups of organisms over generations. So it's not just you, it would be you and your parents and your grandparents and your great-grandparents and so on and so on. Only in this case, it's even farther back than that. We look at, instead of just, 5 or 6 generations, we look at hundreds of generations of things. So it's hereditary, and hereditary means, just like this, it's talking about the DNA here, how it's passed on from the parent to the offspring and so on. So it's hereditary changes in groups of living organisms over time. Another thing that you need to know whenever we talk about the theory of evolution is the scientist Charles Darwin. I'm sure you guys have heard of his name before if you don't know quite what it is. He did his work the 1830s to 50s, somewhere in that time. So I'm going to write down 1840s, so close to 200 years ago. He was an Englishman, an English naturalist, which means that he studied nature. And what he did in the early 1830s is he got a job on, that's just a scribble right there. He got a job on a ship called the HMS Beagle, and they were going, basically they went halfway around the world. And so they traveled over on the other side of South America, on the western side of South America, you could say. And he studied every place they stopped. He would study the flora and the fauna. He would draw pictures, he would take samples and stuff, and flora, the flowers, the plants, fauna, the animals. So he would study that stuff there. And this little mess up is going to bug me, so I need to white it out. There. Okay, so he wrote, after he studied this, he wrote this book called On the Origin of Species, and it was a much longer title than this, so I'm going to put ... But typically we kind of abbreviate it down to On the Origin of Species. And he wrote that after studying, all on this journey he went, after studying all the organisms, but especially after studying life on the Galapagos Islands. Have you guys heard of the Galapagos Islands? If you've gone to the zoo in Oklahoma City, you might have seen the Galapagos Island turtles. They're from there. There's those huge, massive turtles that, big enough for little kids to ride on practically. So the Galapagos Islands are a series of islands that come off the coast of South America, and they're just like, if here's the coast of South America, then here's an island, and they just kind of, that's not perfect, but you get the idea that they're farther and farther away. And he noticed that, oh my gosh, look at the animals on this and compared to this, compared to this, compared to this, and he sees a successive series of changes as it goes by, as it gets farther and farther away from the landmass of South America. So it's an interesting thing. So we'll talk about the Galapagos Islands a little bit more, but mainly we're going to talk about just straightforward, what kind of evidence do we have for evolution. So a couple of things too that we've already talked about. So the first is phylogenetic tree. If you look back in your notes on taxonomy, you actually wrote this down. And the phylogenetic tree, let me pop this back a little bit. Here you have phylogenetic tree right here, 8b. The phylogenetic tree, it shows relationships, the evolutionary relationships between organisms. So a phylogenetic tree shows the evolutionary history and relationships of organisms. And then we talked about this phylogenetic tree, but then within that, they can make some really pretty phylogenetic trees, and I'll try and find a picture for you guys, but the phylogenetic trees, they can make them almost artistic looking. More realistic, however, is a type of phylogenetic tree called a cladogram. And the cladogram is a phylogenetic tree that incorporates when the evolutionary branch arose. So it's and I'm going to abbreviate this, it's a phylogenetic tree that includes let's put when over here, when the evolutionary branch arose. So the length of the branches on the tree are important because they correlate to a time frame. So the length and placement of the branch or the branches, let's say branches here, are equivalent to when a group evolved. How about, let's say, show when a group or a species evolved. So we've talked about those cladograms before. You guys have seen pictures of those before. You had them on your test before. You can look back in the notes, and you can see if when we do taxonomy, you can see some pages where we practiced on those cladograms. So it shows when they evolved. Now, when we talk about phylogenetic, you're talking about that evolutionary history. So there's a word here that's incorporated in here, and that word is phylogeny, and you'll probably see it on the STAR test. They throw this in here. And this is the evolutionary history of an organism. So what type of ancestors, what type of different species of ancestors are in that background? So it's not just a matter of here's your parents, your grandparents, your great-grandparents, but going way, way back until you no longer are talking about what we would typically call human. Or it's much easier to see if you talk about horses. That's really, because we have a lot of fossil evidence with those, so it's really easy to tell like that. Now, when we look at this phylogeny, what we really look at here is we want evidence. See, hear, taste, touch, smell. So in this case, we're looking at the fossil record. And fossils are preserved evidence of an organism. It can be the bones of an organism, and it's no longer bone material. It's been replaced. The material that makes up bone, calcium phosphate, has been placed by a hard mineral that takes its place. So it's no longer like bone material. It's rock. So it replaces it over time. It could be an imprint of it. If you go up, I think it's northwest of Dumas, there are dinosaur tracks in the Texas Panhandle. So they are not a piece of the dinosaur. They're like a footprint in the mud for the dinosaur. So you have tracks in it like that. So we have lots of examples of fossils. They can be imprints, like we can have a footprint in it. So we have a footprint imprints, like footprints. There's some really famous ones around Texas. They have several of them. They can be bone fossil. They can be petrified wood. If you guys have petrified wood, it's no longer wood or plant material, it's actually rock now. So there are lots of different types of those. All right. What we do is then we look at where these things are, and especially when we talk about something called Pangea. So we combine this fossil record with something called biogeography. So I'm going to put another little thing right here. So biogeography is the study of the distribution of plants and animals on our planet. And I'm going to put in parentheses, and fossils. So where are, oh, sorry, I didn't realize that. So it's the study of the distribution of plants and animals and fossils on the earth. Where are they? And what's really cool is that we have, if you look at our continents, what we find is that if you cut them all out of a map, and they kind of fit together like puzzle pieces. So we have something called Pangea, and that's when all the continents were one. So this is when you had one big, huge Godzilla continent. So they were all in continent. Let me spell that right, continent. If you guys have studied, I don't know in which of your classes you studied plate tectonics and earth science, where volcanoes occur and earthquakes occur. That might have been 6th grade when you did that. But at once, if you look at all the continents, they were one big continent together. And so this Pangea is when you had one big continent, and then over time, it broke apart and moved on those tectonic plates. And what we find is really interesting. You can have fossils of one kind on one part of a continent, and on a different continent where those two continents kind of fit together, you'll find the same fossil. So you can have fossils of the same kind on two different continents. And one of the pages that you guys have to work on looks something like this. And so here's Africa, South America, India, Antarctica. This is a part of Pangaea. And when you find fossils, look at where you find fossils. You find fossils of this reptile here on this continent, and also here on this continent over here, where if you look at the map, they don't even contact each other. Let me see if I have a better map. So what you'll find is you'll find here the fossils here and the same fossils over here, where if you look at that, it kind of fits up in there, doesn't it? So this is what's leading us to think, hey, what's going on here? Maybe, again, that's kind of what led to the whole plate tectonics theory. It kind of helped along there too. But you're looking and saying, hey, look at the same fossils are in the same places. They're connected, and if those things had been still connected, you could see, oh yeah, that makes sense because there's just area where you'll find those fossils there. All right, so we have biogeography, we have Pangaea. Biogeography also is talking about the fact that in many cases there are geographical barriers that keep organisms separated from each other. Geographical barriers. They prevent gene flow. Okay, what do I mean by gene flow? Gene flow is talking about, hey, the genes can mix with each other. You know, organisms can mate and have offspring. Their genes are flowing between the two places here. Genes from, it'd be like genes from one group of family, they married and meshed their genetic material together. So you have gene flow between the two groups. If there's some type of geographical barrier, let's say there's a mountain range between them, or let's say you've got the same species of cougar, but on one side there's a mountain range and on the other side there's a mountain range. Those aren't going to be naturally mating and having offspring with each other. So as time goes by, then they can actually evolve differently from each other because they're not sharing genes between each other. It's anything that could prevent the gene flow would be like mountains, bodies of water. Think of the Great Lakes even. And if you have a small animal, doesn't even have to be that great a lake, does it? Just a good sized lake. So those are examples that might limit the gene flow between organisms there. All of these things, when we look at biogeography and we look at the fossil record, they show evidence of common ancestry. So this is what we look at to find the evidence. When we look at the fossil record, we can find fossils, and fossils are pretty rare, but we can find fossils that show the stages of development, different fossils that are closely related but not quite the same, and they're in different layers of the earth. The layer of the earth where the fossil is that's deepest down was the one that was put down first. So it's the oldest, right? As you go up through different layers of the rock, like when you go over to the canyon, you can see the different layers of rock. If it's found in the bottom layer of rock, I mean that's going to be the oldest. The ones that are closer to the top are going to be younger. And you can find different fossil evidence in each of those. And so you can see, oh yeah, the fossils are similar, but they're not quite the same. And so something's happened, something's changing throughout those. And then when you look at biogeography, again, you're looking at where these fossils are found, and you find these vast stretches of fossils that you find, and they're in the same layer of dirt. But they might be on two different continents. Same fossils, two different continents, but if you put the continents together, it matches up nicely, kind of like a big puzzle or something. Okay, we will work on B7A, the second part, a little bit later.